All right, I'll adjust and we'll just go ahead and dive in. So, kick off. Thank all of you for joining us for the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective reading of Anti-Oedipus. We are in our second reading. We're calling it Anti-Oedipus 2021 because we are cheeky, I guess. Today we're going to be reading section 2, part, I believe it's 3, 2-3, which is the connective synthesis of production. We left off last week reading about the 3 texts of Freud and their major critique of Freudian psychoanalysis. And now they're moving into what they believe is the function of the unconscious, the machine that is the unconscious and how it works. From here out, it's really going to get very specific, and it is really fun. This is the stuff I really dig. But I'll dive in right now with the beginning of the connective synthesis of production. Given the syntheses of the unconscious, the practical problem is that of their use, legitimate or not, and of the conditions that define a use of synthesis as legitimate or not. Take the example of homosexuality, though it is something more than an example. We noted how, in Proust, the famous pages of Sodom and Gomorrah, Cities of the Plain, interlaced 2 openly contradictory themes: the fundamental guilt of the accursed races and the radical innocence of flowers. The diagnosis of Oedipal homosexuality with a mother fixation, of a dominant depressive nature and a sadomasochistic guilt, was quickly applied to Proust. In a more general way still, some critics were too quick in discovering contradictions, either in order to declare them irreducible, or to resolve them, or to show that they were merely apparent, according to preference. In truth, there are never contradictions, apparent or real, but only degrees of humor. And inasmuch as reading itself has its degrees of humor from black to white, which it evaluates the coexisting degrees of what it reads, the sole problem is always one of allocation on a scale of intensities that assigns the position and use of each thing, each being, or each scene. There is this and then that, and let's make do with it. Too bad if it doesn't suit us. Where do we start?
When Proust is talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, what he's really talking about then, right, is like the deceptive nature behind the signs that we share with each other, because they imply and show us the existence of an entire world of that person that we don't take part in, where these signs are coming from that we then have to decipher. So he's saying like Sodom and Gomorrah represent the 2 actual unknowable internalities of each of the communicating parties, right? Is that what he's talking about? No,
I think that's how I kind of took it. The way he's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, or internal contradictions, the sort of classic Freudian way of looking at, a person believes these few things as, let's call them whole objects, and they have these inside of them, and there are contradictions, and those contradictions are the things that cause us to have issues, the problems of sort of your internal systems. And they're saying, no, there are never contradictions, apparent or real. It's about degrees of humor. And Ken has a great link that he posted called Humorism, which is not necessarily about
all the deceptive. Sorry, here I just found this from Proust and Signs. All the deceptive signs emitted by a loved woman converge upon the same secret, the world of Gomorrah, a kind of a priority that jealousy discovers, because the world expressed is always a world that excludes us, even when she gives us a mark of preference. So that's kind of like what he's bringing up here, right? We interpret all the signs, but at the end, we come up against the sign of Gomorrah as something like a world we cannot enter, in which the other person lives.
So if I can just interject for a second, that sort of idea is in that tale, right? With it ending where you can't look back at the city as it's about to burn, and then you look back and you turn into stone. And this is recapitulated in the Orpheus tale, right? It's the exact same thing with I can't remember her name, but the lady he loves or whatever, as they're about to walk out of hell. I can't remember who looks back, whether it's him or her.
Eurydice.
Thank you. And yeah, it's like this world that you can't look into, but you can. And I don't know if it's necessarily about the sublime, but this is a point about the sublime, and Schelling makes this point about the sublime, and I think Schiller too, that it's this limit to what's reasonable or whatever, but at the same time it completes one's like aesthetic and moral education or whatever, to be able to know about these limit experiences, one of them being able to like fully disclose another person's universe.
I'd be a bit careful here though, because what we're saying might that very well may apply to Proust and Signs. But I think this first paragraph, they're talking about how Proust uses two contradictory themes, right, and how there's not actually a contradiction between them, right? So there's a point there, which is going to tie us back to like what they're dealing with in this first paragraph and this section, right? Which is going to be, how do we know, or how do we not even just how do we determine, but what happens when the use of the syntheses are illegitimate, right? What are the conditions for an illegitimate and legitimate use? And if it's not going to be in terms of contradiction, right? So if what defines illegitimacy is not contradiction, but conditions, right? That seems to be the big move they're making right here. So if we go back to like the example of Proust Ben was bringing up, and even where Brutz and Ken were taking that with Freud, right? So there's a way in which psychoanalysis will use Oedipus to resolve contradictions, right? We've seen how psychoanalysis is going to be under scrutiny in this section for illegitimate use of the three syntheses, right? So in resolving the contradictions in Proust through like the sadomasochism and the mother aspect, there's going to be I think what they're driving at is there's going to be an illegitimate use of the synthesis here.
It could be, but there is still Freud also wrote a book about jokes in relation to the unconscious. So there is still a degree of humor in Freud, and what he applies to the relation of the unconscious, I think that it is just the Oedipal unconscious, which is at the trial here, of which we are holding trial for, and not Freud's general unconscious yet. We're not there, I suppose, because in the jokes in relation to the unconscious, there's just this unspoken relation people have to words and sentences, which we find humoristic, which we get, which is part of the unconscious. So I think it's not yet the version from Freud. It's just bringing a polarity to it by making it about this or that, which is a typical French sentiment, because Sartre also wrote a lot about the phenomenology and the existence of things and the relation of the person to the existing object, which also came forward in a paragraph about this or that, which is a relationship people have if cognitively to the objects in the world. So that's it's still, of course, let's maybe continue.
One of the things that's important, if you have not read Proust, we probably should explain the scenes that they're talking about, the handful of pages that they're referring specifically to, because no one has yet. The main character, the narrator inside of the fourth book of In Search of Lost Time, hanging out in this amazing orchard with these gorgeous flowers all around him. It's the Duchess's flowers, I think. And he's watching them get pollinated, bees going between, and the tone and the way he's describing it, he's talking about it as this very natural, simple, beautiful process. And then he comes across two men who are having sex in the area. He's able to see them as well. The tone shifts decidedly. Not super hard. It's intended to be a little bit open, but that is the specific moment they're talking about, is that juxtaposition between, on the one side, as they say, the flower's radical innocence, where even though we're observing the flowers having sex, which we are, it's not how we know it, but that's what's happening. And then there's this hyper base act of, as they're referred to in the novel, the homosexuals, as the cursed races, are also having, the two guys are over having sex in another place in the area. And it's seen as this interesting sort of, I don't know, everyone's got a lot of interpretations. That's the scene they're talking about. The difficulty is that that scene has a lot of interpretations, which is, I think, what they're referring to here. Beckett, for example, at one point said that it was, what did he say? I had the quote up on my screen somewhere. Samuel Beckett said, flower and plant have no conscious will. They are shameless, exposing their genitals. And so, in a sense, are Proust's men and women. They are shameless. There is no question of right and wrong, which is something very Beckett. Conversely, the entire scene is where people started to assign and say that, well, obviously Proust is latently homosexual and he's dealing with these things because he doesn't have a good relationship with this. If you look through the books, you can see he has terrible relationships with the law, with men, with all of that. So it's obviously his father. Like this is how a lot of people interpret these things, and definitely did around the time of this, especially. So I think they're doing this as more of a direct response. To me, they're doing it as a direct response to the critique that a lot of people had of like basically hypersimplifying a lot of what was done inside of Proust's book by grabbing the whole objects, putting him in relation directly to them, triangulating his place, and then saying, oh, this obviously says the things we need it to. These other things, oh yeah, no, they don't work for our theory, but fuck them, we don't care, which is their last line here. There is this and then that, and let's make do with this, and oh, too bad if it doesn't suit us. It's kind of that last bit.
It's
how
actually
I read it.
it's actually very simple, because if you view that scene from the perspective of the homosexuals, then of course the flower is perverted, like Beckett suggests in a way that because like when you make love, you make the other person your world. I assume that's the same for homosexuals as heterosexuals. And when you write it from a perspective of you of course have not you don't have the perspective of the homosexuals. You don't make the flowers your world, but you have this and that. You have the homosexuals and you have the flowers, which are two separate things. So it's of course because they're human, because flowers can be anthropomorphic. It is a tough way to look at this or that, because there is a certain sense of humanity, but of course there is still the difference, because like a flower can't love, and love is intrinsic to the human condition. So the loving homosexuals are basically taking his writing and transposing it towards maybe an Oedipal sentiment, of course, if you read it that way. But they disagree on that, and they say no, they don't. This scene is not perverted by the homosexuals, because the flowers are there and they have the same value. You could also, as a viewer, anthropomorphize the flowers, make them part of your world just as much as the homosexuals.
No, I'm gonna agree with all that, but I think that specifically this paragraph is trying to talk specifically through the legitimate or illegitimate use of the syntheses, and to them, the illegitimate use is the separation and triangulation based on whole objects within someone's unconscious, and that's their argument kind of that they're making. I think all of what you're saying is, I think, spot on for the larger picture of what they're getting at, but specifically for this paragraph, because a lot of people haven't gotten as far as you have in this book. So it's just the specific thing they're just kind of pointing at is that moment, and some critics were too quick in discovering contradictions, either in order to declare them irreducible or to resolve them, or to show they were merely apparent according to preference. That's the specific thing they're laying at critique, which I think I'm going to apologies for interrupting. I do want to move on, Joe, to the next paragraph, because I think some of what you're saying is also in there.
I'm just happy you agree with me. That's all.
Yeah, no, it happens sometimes. Don't worry. In this regard, it is possible that Charlot's coarse admonition is prophetic. Quote, "A lot we care about our old grandmother, you little shit." For what does take place in Search of Lost Time, one and the same story with infinite variations? It is clear that the narrator sees nothing, hears nothing, and that he is a body without organs, or like a spider poised in its web, observing nothing, but responding to the slightest sign, to the slightest vibration, by springing on its prey. Everything begins with nebula, the statistical holes whose outlines are blurred, molar or collective formations comprising singularities distributed haphazardly, a living room, a group of girls, a landscape. Then, within these nebula, or these collectives, sides take shape, series are arranged, persons figure in this series, under strange laws of lack, absence, asymmetry, exclusion, non-communication, vice, and guilt. Next, everything becomes blurred again. Everything comes apart, but this time in a molecular and pure multiplicity, where the partial objects, the boxes, the vessels, all have their positive determinations and enter into aberrant communication following a transversal that runs through the whole work, an immense flow that each partial object produces and cuts again, reproduces and cuts at the same time. More than vice, says Proust, it is madness and its innocence that disturb us. If schizophrenia is the universal, the great artist is indeed the one who scales the schizophrenic wall and reaches the land of the unknown, where he no longer belongs to any time, any milieu, any school. As I was saying, Joe, I think some of what you're saying in here, it comes back in this paragraph, I think, in a really crisp way. The specific thing they're talking about here, and they will get into it again later, and we will spend a lot of time discussing this, is the way that they're talking about the molar items, the collective formation comprising singularities. When we talk about innocence or a garden or a house, it's a large conglomerate of a whole shitload of things inside of it. We see that, we say that, it's a great idea. We'll call it a whole object. But it's filled with divisions. Once we look closer at the house, we begin to separate things out. This is the bedroom, the living room, the front door, the aviary, if you have one of those. I don't know why I fucking thought about aviary. I was reading a comic book last night with one. What the fuck is wrong with me? You have these moments, these things that you're able to see, and you begin creating divisions. And as you do that, you actually, if you go far enough, I think is what they're saying here, that you end up getting, once again, blurred, because the things are blurry. When I say house, where does a house end and another one begin? Like, in order to know that, we have to divide things up further. Well, the house has the yard, so does that one. Well, this one has a fence. Well, where is it divided? Like, in order to find that line, we have to continue dividing. But if you keep dividing, you actually pass through blurry again in order to get to what they are calling partial objects, the molecular, the pure multiplicity of everything, the little bits of things that we can't even necessarily directly describe and talk about. These partial objects themselves are this bedrock of things, the molecular. It's a beautiful movement from molar to molecular in the explanation here. Am I far off?
No, I think you are spot on, and I have in my visions, I just grabbed the Negaristani book I'm reading right now, which I think adds to this in a very nice way. If you let me quote it, 1 second. There, it's also an opposition, and I think it's also a molecular opposition. So first off, we have the molecular mass of fuzzy gray, contact with a heap of black, screeching noise from the direction of mass of fuzzy gray. But what it is not, excited monkey touching the monolith. Monkey screams. So this is like very descriptive of what is underneath everything. Like if you sometimes maybe people can identify with this, sometimes the world turns black. You sort of distance yourself from everything, and you are not gone. The world is not gone, but it's simply not a tiny fragment which you actually want to interact with. You have, like, let's say the flowers again. You have the flowers which you want to interact with, but you can't get there because it is all black. And this is the difference between the molar and the molecular, where the molecular is like the blackness, where you take everything inward. So the whole world is basically this shape, this one shape, which comes in immediate, in like an immediate. It has an immediacy, and on the other hand, you want to interact with one piece of this world, with like this lamp or this computer or this device, and that is the molar, which you can't always get at. And Schizo, I'm not sure where he fits in this situation, but I thought it was nice to take a bit of Negaristani and add him to this mix. But yeah, sure. I'm
Yeah.
finishing.
We got asked, what is the context of a lot we care about our old grandmother, you little shit? So it's been too long since I've read Proust. I'm currently rereading all of it. I haven't gotten to that point yet. And the versions I have don't have the literal same translation. So not able to directly find it. I think someone's going to tell me I'm really fucking wrong. I think it's from the second book. The character now, I'm going to mispronounce everything. Nausgard, I want to say. I've been reading Mausgard the comic, so I want to say Nausgard. The way that he talks and screams at people is like this really interesting, like bursts of screaming at people and calling them little shits. He has one person he's specific. Yeah, second volume of In Search of Lost Time. I'm sorry. The whole series of Proust, the whole thing. This is book 2. There's a huge climax with Nausgard where he basically just loses his shit and screams, "You little shit!" Blah blah blah. Have a lot of good it's done me, you little shit. I think it's in that context of that, but I'm not at that point yet. Literally, I'm like 2 weeks away, so I'll be able to answer that soon, Remke. Sorry. If anyone knows that book better, this would be the time to jump in. So I found the section just by searching the word shit, which is actually in this book quite a bit. I'm going to read just a little bit apart. I don't think it's the grandmother scene, but it's got to be the same character. If I have learned one thing over these years, which seems to me immensely important, particularly in an era as ours, overflowing with mediocrity, it's the following. Don't believe you are anybody. Do not believe you are somebody, because you are not. You're a smug, mediocre little shit. Do not believe you're anything special. Do not believe you're worth anything, because you aren't. You're just a little shit. Keep your head down and work, you little shit. Like, goes on for a page. I think it's from that. I'm thinking it's from that scene. Does anyone have questions on the molar or the molecular or anything else to add to this part?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. So I think what you've been saying about, especially in your take on the first paragraph, is really well poised here. So we're seeing how what's going on between these two aspects, that there's not contradiction here. even though we might question, right, the role of guilt in that on this one side, just that we might question the relationship of guilt and the flowers, which I think he did a nice job pointing out how the two juxtapose, but the relationship isn't one of contradiction, right? So it's not that kind of problem. So what we see going on here with the narrator in where they're taking Proust right now is the narrator is going to act as the body without organs here, right? So they're right. It is clear that the narrator sees nothing, hears nothing, and that he is a body without organs, or like a spider poised on its web. Right? We know where they're going with this. The thing I want to point out here is with what they're laying out here in terms of the molecular and the molar, right? So they're showing us how the body without organs, at one level, has this I don't want to say transitionary phase, serves as a limit between the two, right? And we're seeing how in the molar, we have this statistical aggregation. We have these collective formations comprising singularities distributed haphazardly, right? So there's not like an organization from like a rationality here. We're seeing how things kind of take shape haphazardly, to use their word, right? The asymmetry, strange laws of lack and that. At the molecular level, we see how the narrator plays in with different arrangements and connections, right? Where we're seeing the flows being cut by the partial objects and differentiated in that manner. So this is helping us get into that scene here of this how these syntheses function under these conditions.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually jump to the next paragraph because it continues with examples. As a quick little preface, it's important before I read this. More Proust. There's a lot of Proust coming. We will at some day do Proust in Science, which is the reason I'm rereading all of this book. But Albertine is the narrator's first kiss. Like, someone else has to have read this fucking tome of stories. I want to say Albertine's the first kiss. It's this big deal. It's actually really beautifully written. Really beautifully written.
Some of us were too busy cleaning our rooms, Brooks.
Oh yes. Well, not everyone. Everyone has to be a lobster someday. All right, I'll give it a read. Such is the case in an illustrative passage. The first kiss given Albertine. Albertine's face is at first a nebula, barely extracted from the collective of girls. Then her person disengages itself through a series of views that are like distinct personalities, with Albertine's face jumping from one plane to another as the narrator's lips draw nearer her cheek. At last, within the magnified proximity, everything falls apart like a face drawn in sand. Albertine's face shatters into molecular partial objects, while those on the narrator's face rejoin the body without organs, eyes closed, nostrils pinched shut, mouth filled. What is more, their entire love tells the same story. From the statistical nebula, from the molar entirety of men-women loves, there emerge the two accursed and guilty series that bear witness to the same castration with two non-superimposable sides, the Sodom series and the Gomorrah series, each one excluding the other. The scene where he kisses Albertine is very much about that, the way that it's described. And if you have ever had a first kiss, and if you haven't, you will someday. But if you have, it's very much that intensity. If you think of the moment to moment, and it's how Proust describes it, it's really vivid. As he's looking at her, he sees, she's gorgeous, and he's comparing her very much to other girls and all of that. He sees this sort of sea of girls with her as this single face within it. As he gets closer, it becomes just her. As he gets even closer, the description of the smell of her skin and the way that her eye moves or her cheek moves or her lips and how they tremble, like everything becomes very, very, very partial objects. And so this is, again, a transit to help explain when we move from molar to molecular and the way to think about through all of those. Earlier, Michael asks, why do they say, boxes for partial objects? The way to think of partial objects is as opposed to full ones. It's very easy. Partial objects are irreducible in and of themselves. That's kind of their constant sort of thing that they keep saying, that they're mocking people believe these things are irreducible, and they're not. The kiss of a lips is not a singular thing. It's a huge collection of a lot of little partial objects that are connecting and disconnecting and firing off and all kinds of stuff, as they're going to describe. The goal is to try to find how deep those go, because if we can still divide it, it's kind of not a partial object still. But I do want to continue the next paragraph unless someone has a thing, because it's about to finish off this point nicely.
I just want to say that it's important that the castration is in the molar, so you're totally becoming castrated in a way. It's not like a partial castration. So I just wanted to say that I think I'm not sure, but I think it's definitive that. Sorry, I'm having this the other way around. It's molecular. Castration is molecular, and it's not molar. And I think it's throughout the book this way. So maybe someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's like an important of an easy way to identify with castration, that it's always the molecular.
I think the castration always impinges on the molecular, but castration isn't necessarily something that exists in the molecular. That it is a molar concept and as a thing, but anti-production, which they will get into at some point, is produced in the molecular. Like anti-production essentially kind of plays that role, but castration as a thing doesn't exist at the molecular level. The effects of it do, but that's mostly through a lot of other complicated stuff. So we'll get to that. That's not, we're only in the first syntheses for right now. I'm trying to stick with it. So,
but thanks for explaining, because I had trouble with that. So I like your explanation, Brooks.
Yeah, this is all complicated as shit. Don't worry. Next paragraph. This is not all, however, since the vegetal theme, the innocence of flowers, brings us yet another message and another code. Everyone is bisexual. Everyone has two sexes, but partitioned, non-communicating. The man is merely the one in whom the male part, and the woman the one in whom the female part dominates statistically. So that at the level of elementary combinations, at least 2 men and 2 women must be made to intervene to constitute the multiplicity in which the transverse communications are established. Connections of partial objects and flows. The male part of a man can communicate with the female part of a woman, but also with the male part of a woman or with the female part of another man, and yet again with the male part of the other man, etc. Here, all guilt ceases, for it cannot cling to such flowers as these. In contrast to the alternative of the either-or exclusions, there is the either-or of the combinations and permutations where the differences amount to the same without ceasing to be differences. I just want to continue the next paragraph because I know what people are wanting to talk about. It continues this really quick. We are statistically or molarly heterosexual, but personally homosexual without knowing it or being fully aware of it. And finally, we are transsexual in an elemental molecular sense. It's a really fun, interesting set of lines. It's going to be a whole thing to discuss. That is why Proust, the first to deny all Oedipalizing interpretations of his own interpretations, contrasts 2 kinds of homosexuality, or rather 2 regions, only one of which is Oedipal, exclusive and depressive, the other being anOedipal, schizoid included and inclusive. Quote, for some, doubtless those whose childhoods were timid, the material kind of pleasure they take does not matter, so long as they can relate it to a male countenance. While others, whose sensuality is doubtless more violent, give their material pleasure certain imperious localizations. The second group would shock most people by their avowals. They live perhaps less exclusively under Saturn's satellite, for in their case women are not entirely excluded. But those in the second group seek out women who prefer women, women who suggest young men. Indeed, they can take with such women the same pleasure as with a man. For in their relations with women they play, for the woman who prefers woman, the role of another woman, and at the same time a woman offers them approximately what they find in a man. I feel like someone's going to be just way better versed in a lot of this stuff than me. That one's the last 2 paragraphs are beasts.
one thing that like strikes me about this again, we're reading through Proust and Signs right now. Is he will make the series of Gomorrah the realm of the beloved, and of Sodom the realm of the lover. And then here he's saying that like each person will have like internal male and female that communicates with other person's internal male and female. So like we are each having both of those series inside of ourselves, but they don't even communicate with each other inside of ourselves. So like the world that we're excluding the people who love us from is different than necessarily the signs that we use when we are like loving them back and being excluded from their world. I think that's, I
But
don't know.
Ben, aren't we talking about? I mean, this is like the desiring machine, right? So, isn't it outside of the body without organs? Just a small adjustment to what you said, because the rest was, I think, correct.
Yeah, I might have used like a wrong word or two. I'll totally admit that.
Well, it's of course inside is correct in a way, but not from the body without organs. It's
Right.
just
I would agree with you there. I'd give you that point. I should have said like on the surface of, or
well, that it's very nice. Everybody is so agreeable today. I like this.
It's a really interesting set of paragraphs. But again, I think Ben, I think you really put that nicely. It's the reduction of things and the ability for things to be basically partial objects and desiring machines connecting changes how we think about how these groups or what desire actually is inside of the unconscious and how it operates, instead of the line at the beginning. We are statistically or molarly hetero, personally homosexual, without knowing it or being fully aware of it, and finally transsexual in an elemental molecular sense. It's just a very, very spot on, I think, view of how they see desiring machines working, and I think how they operate in through the rest of this, as well as ATP, and I mean certainly through Proust and Signs.
I have this small anecdote. Let me know if I'll try to phrase it correctly, because it's kind of hard, because it was like when I was in, I think, like the second grade of elementary school, so I was a very small child. There was this first grader who came to school, and he was wearing a dress, and it was a guy. And I kid you not, the guy's name was Bear. And he enjoyed, just he wasn't like feminine or anything. That's the thing. He wasn't a homosexual either. You know, it wasn't like it was like the 90s, and I don't think like sex change operations were really a thing. But he wasn't like an inverted or whatever. He wasn't like into being a woman. He just liked wearing a dress at a child's age, you know, and everybody accepted it. Nobody bullied him or whatever, because for him it was such just a commonality. Het was such een ja, vanzelfsprekendheid. It was considered just the way he was for him. That's the trouble with Dutch and English. You know, I sometimes lose my track of the. But it's in any case, the point I'm making is that the 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 like the how the desiring machines are organized within people can differ on a very early age, and I think they are spot on, and it's actually fairly strange that this late in the process that this is developing. Well, maybe not, but because previous centuries were more restricted in a way. But sorry, I just wanted to give that small piece of my mind. So maybe it's easier to visualize like a child like being innocent and liking just partial stuff of the feminine and like integrating it in his psyche in such a way that it's self-evident. That was the word I was looking for. It was for him self-evident that he wore a dress, and for other people it was therefore self-evident also, because you could see on his face and you could see his gestures, like if you were a man. And you like, of course, they're saying here, you focus on the manly part. Like they were at ease in him. You know, if you looked at him, I think if he wore like just like pants and a shirt, like you would think something is wrong with him, with the guy. And yeah, these people exist, you know, who just who are not like perverted because a child has no
Well,
sexuality yet. But
right. No, and I think so. The lines here, and it's towards the end, they start really touching into, as Michael brought out, the Plato's Aristophanes myth of the androgyny, uh, the nature that apparently once upon a time all humans were round little, just little Pac-Mans with 4 legs, like round little things that were dudes on one side, women on the other, and the androgyne were the other. They were the ones from the moon. And then, oh no, we had to get cut in half. And so the men who desired men were the men before. It's just this really hilarious myth. They're kind of talking in that direction, is how they use the words towards the end, because they are talking about, as Proust would say, making the other person their world, where to combining the joining. And it's why they say things like, we are statistically or morally heterosexual at large. Like that's, again, the law of large numbers. However, personally, we are actually homosexual because we are us. Like that's kind of how the subject works. And then at the elemental or molecular sense, we are kind of whatever is being desired. There's no such thing at the molecular level as man or woman. That's not how it works at all. In sort of their view of things, and they get into this later. Partial objects don't have it's not a man object. A penis isn't even a man object. The tip of a dick isn't a man object or a woman object. It's just a partial object. And so, like, being able to sort of step beyond that when we're talking about such things and desires is, I think, the real goal of this paragraph. Again, trying to get us back to desiring machines and how they connect and what is connecting, that it's not these ideas that are connecting, but partial objects. Sorry, Jack, go ahead.
No, I really like what you're saying there, because I think that's spot on. I think that's really it. We can compare it with the Platonic myth there, but it's a little bit different, right? Like you're saying, at the molar level, there's heterosexuality, the either or of sexuality, right? So where we're seeing in Proust, you relate your sexuality to a man or a woman, right? Which he's looking at here through countenance. At the personal level, we can see it in that sense too, right? Kind of like you were saying, bro, it's like it's had a very personal relationship. So you're kind of with, there's a problem of identification there, perhaps. But at the molecular level,
sorry, go ahead.
So you're spot on there that the desiring machines, what they're in that second sense, that molecular sense that Proust is talking about here, you're spot on that they're not connecting for the sake of woman or mother, but that the transsexual nature is the functionality. So the reason we can get the same from either or is because there's not that distinction of male female, because the partial objects can rearrange in the assemblage and connect differently in that first synthesis, which at the molecular level is what's functioning there, as opposed to like, how do I have sex with a woman, or if I'm going to do that, how do I relate it to the countenance of a man, right? That either or again.
Yeah, it's I think some sort of doubt which must be either like basically sublimated to either the molecular or the molar, because the doubt, let's say the
no.
either or. No?
No. We're talking about pure positive. So the way they were talking earlier is about how we have to divide in order for the molar to not be fuzzy. But at some point we reach another stage of fuzziness where things start blending together and becoming confusing, that we start entering the world of partial objects. But partial objects are that of almost pure there's not gaps in the same way that there is for literally anything.
Maybe if I maybe can explain myself a little bit. I meant doubt in like the Sartre's conception of doubt, which is I think totally positive, because it's like this cogito essential part of the cogito. So I made it. I thought that was maybe unclear. I thought I explained. Sorry.
No. So for this scene, there's a scene in Seinfeld that comes to mind whenever I read this, where George Costanza goes in for a massage. He thinks he's going to get a pretty girl because Jerry just did, and instead walks this big, Nordic blonde, attractive guy. And George is like naked, and the guy starts massaging his legs and working up, and then it fades away. It comes to later. George is mortified, slowly walking around. It's like, why? What's wrong? He's like, it moved. Like that's the joke, is that he was aroused by this massage he got from a man, and now he's wondering if he's gay. The whole episode is about him wondering his own sexuality. That's the kind of the humor of it. Again, 90s. But the reason I connect to this is because it's the idea of, oh, it moved. Oh, my penis was aroused. Oh, I had sexual desire in this situation. It must be because I'm attracted to a man. I must be. That's not it. That's the whole point here. They're talking about is like moving beyond the idea of you being your penis being, oh, I'm attracted to that. It's like, no, it's partial objects to partial objects. Technically, partial objects are all transsexual. It's not that you were attracted to man, you were attracted to the way this felt and the way all of these things were connecting. It's much more complicated than that. Instead of just being this simple, like, oh, yes, I must be gay. And that's kind of their setup. I don't know if George necessarily would be happier knowing that he probably had some level of molecular transsexuality, but like, I think like his neuroticism is something they speak to a lot. A lot of the stuff, I think, that flows back to sort of George's neurotic, shitty behavior. And the 90s, I think, did that in general too. But it's just this, it feels like that's a lot of what they're talking about here.
I think you're right about that. The only thing I would add is that because we mentioned sublimation, because we're dealing with the molar and the molecular, right? I don't think we're going to find that kind of like so sublimation, as I understand, occurs in relation to a superego, which is going to take a desire, right? It's going to condition it with some sort of social norm, in a very simple manner. And the sublimation occurs where there's a tension in the unconscious that the ego needs to release for the id, but the superego is redirecting that. So you've got to find a way to release the tension in a socially acceptable way, or really a superego acceptable manner. And the reason I don't think we're going to see that here is because we're dealing with the syntheses, the molar and the molecular, where we don't really have a superego, or I'm not even sure that we have a big other per se, regulating desire in that manner. We're going to, especially because we don't really have the ego in that manner to begin with. This is all like, this is all pre-subject, right? Well, I don't want to say put in Simondon, but this is like pre-I, and we don't even have the ego in that capacity to begin with here, right? We're going to see how subjectivity is produced, without really needing a fixed I in that manner.
But isn't it right that we are like statically or in the either or? It is part of sublimation, and then when it becomes like dynamically or personally, it changes. But before that, I think it's applicable, and I think that is what they meant with the either or the. I have a different translation, so either or the whatever comes next. So
I
Well,
I disagree because of the functionalities here, and because the desiring production's not being, I don't think it's being sublimated by a super ego, and then the tension's got to be released through a norm. I think what we're seeing instead is how the syntheses function in relation to the molar and the molecular, right? And we'll see later in chapter 3 how the socius plays into that and the creation of territories. But I don't think there's a
Really quick,
sublimation.
Jack, just real quick. I can just say, wholly, sublimation is not necessary inside of their version of the unconscious and desire, because social machines can invest desire directly into the social field. There is no mediation required by Freud's sublimation.
yeah, but it's like they're saying here, they're saying static. They're saying that we are heterosexual also. So they take the opposite of that, right? So I say they give intentionally a wrongful explanation for a second. They say, like, statically we are heterosexual, but personally we are homosexual. And then the homosexual is, of course, the molecular.
No. So let me try one more time. Desiring machines make up everything. There is no secondary thing. Everything is only desiring machines and partial objects. That's it. Our grouping of things changes that, but the grouping of things is what is the molar. So at the very basic level, we only have partial objects, and partial objects have no homo or heterosexuality. In fact, they're essentially transsexual, because any one of them can apply to any sex of any sort of thing, depending on their usage and how they join up with other things inside of concepts. As those objects, partial objects connect and the syntheses fire off, it creates a subject. The subject is itself, aware of itself, connected to itself, encompasses its own desiring machines, looks back on its body without organs and goes, fucking A, that's me, I like it. Part of that is whatever sexual organs that person has. And so naturally we are, as a subject and as an individual, and I'm doing that in hard fucking quotes, we are personally homosexual. And then after that, because we are basically statistically at this point, we just look at the law of large numbers and we just go, oh, most people are hetero. Probably because of, I don't know, some genetic thing, or the fact that that's just kind of the averages as the time being because of social machines as they exist. That there is no separation. The heterosexual is filled with partial objects that are transsexual and is also personally homosexual, all at once in a singularity.
I think the thing is that his translations got static instead of statistic. So where they're talking about the molar, he's reading in terms of like there's a fixity there, which would sound like a superego, right? So it should be statistical because we're talking about how, so there's desiring machines on the molecular and the molar, we have the social machines and that, how these like get aggregated, and there's a statistical kind of distribution.
That would be a problem. Yes. Just assume if at any point a translation says Deleuze Guattari are saying a thing is static, there's a fuck up in the translation somewhere. Like anyone who's like, what they believe in is very specific static things that don't change, you can kind of assume that something's wrong, generally. But I think the next paragraph continues talking about what we're discussing here. So I'm going to continue into that. The opposition here is between two uses of the connective syntheses, a global and specific use, and a partial and non-specific use. In the first, desire at the same time receives a fixed subject, an ego specified according to a given sex, and complete objects defined as global persons. The complexity and the foundations of such an operation appear more distinctly if we consider the mutual reactions between the different syntheses of the unconscious following a given use. It is first of all the synthesis of recording that in effect situates on its surface of inscription within the conditions of Oedipus a definable and differentiable ego in relation to parental images serving as coordinates, mother-father. There we have a triangulation that implies in its essence a constituent prohibition, and that conditions the differentiation between persons. Prohibition of incest with the mother, prohibition against taking the father's place. But a strange sort of reasoning leads one to conclude that since it is forbidden, that very thing was desired. In reality, global persons, even the very form of persons, do not exist prior to the prohibitions that weigh on them and constitute them, any more than they exist prior to the triangulation into which they enter. Desire receives its first complete objects and is forbidden them at one and the same time. Therefore, it is indeed the same Oedipal operation that lays the foundations for the possibility of its own resolution, by way of a differentiation of persons in conformity with the prohibition, as well as the possibility for its own failure or stagnation by falling into the undifferentiated as the reverse side of the differentiation created by the prohibitions. Incest by identification with the father, homosexuality by identification with the mother. The personal material of transgression does not exist prior to the prohibition any more than does the form of persons. This is where we start getting it, and they will be very clear about this later on, but they asked early on, and they will ask again Reich's question about why do people desire fascism? And they say often, people say they were tricked. They're tricking, they're lying to them, they're telling them the other thing. It's like, no, they also aren't tricked into Oedipus. That's not really the right way to look at it. These things aren't tricking people. They are global people being shoved into a place they kind of don't belong in the unconscious. They naturally, because of where they're at, form desire in very definable, specific, and triangulated ways. That's how I read that paragraph. I really like this paragraph. If anyone wants to jump in, go for it.
Yeah, I think you're kicking it off well there. So we're seeing how the two syntheses. We're seeing the two uses of the connective synthesis here, right? We're seeing it at the molar use with global persons. See if I can find this. A global and specific use as opposed to a partial and non-specific use. And the first desire at the same time receives a fit subject, an ego, specified according to a given set, and complete objects defined as global persons. Right, so on one hand, we're seeing the first synthesis, or the first kind of the first synthesis. There's a tongue twister for you. How that relates to global persons, how that relates to the aggregations and that. On the other hand, we're seeing on the molecular side how it works through partial objects. So we're looking right back into that last thing we saw where on one level we can talk about how there's like that either or distinction in sexuality, right? That enables like heterosexuality. But then we're seeing how on the flip side, the first synthesis doesn't necessarily work through the connections in that either or, but on the other hand is either or, and I'm kind of using the second synthesis to say this, but with these connections and with the differentiations of flows and the machinic productivity that's happening here, to put it back in the first synthesis now, that's not really taking place intending for a complete subject, intending for global persons, right? Or like large collectives that are sort of homogenized.
Yes, I suppose that like the registration synthesis or the production synthesis in relation to the registration synthesis, which is in between is the triangulation of the Oedipal, which is the incest prevention, is in a form code. So I think it's like the word of a magnet that gets demagnified or whatever, loses its polarities. It's become inert in a way because it's code. So the Oedipal is there, but it's not active. It is a code which is inscribed in the relationship of the mother, the father, and later on the sister or brother. And I think the code is it's important to note that it's code because it's not named. But I think that's between the production and the registration. Like they communicate in code. I think it's earlier mentioned in one of the earlier paragraphs, and I just thought I should share.
No, it's great. The last sentence, Bostgard asked, can we expand on it, rephrase or talk about it? The last sentence, the personal material of transgression does not exist prior to the prohibition any more than does the form of persons. The way Freud and psychoanalytic thought believes that the Oedipus complex works, Ken, please tell me where I'm wrong here if I am, is that the ego and the superego are essentially the interplay of it with the id in there. And between those three, that is the sort of interplay of your unconscious. You exist as part of that. You as a subject are sort of the wrapper of these things, and it's you are immanent to them. They're putting the steps before that. They're saying, look, the subject, the person who, the whole person, the whole form of you, doesn't exist until long after this sort of transgression exists. But actually, even more so, the personal material of the transgression, the desire to fuck your mom, doesn't exist prior to the prohibition because of the nature of how the three syntheses work. You actually get the prohibition, it gets inserted because it's a demand for a whole object and a pointing of desire to it, as well as the demand that you don't. That sort of goes hand in hand. And because it's whole objects, it's added to the body without organs, and your desires hit that. And the material of the transgression, the desire to actually do that thing, doesn't exist until then, because the subject and all these other things come long after. So this is how they start taking down the idea of Oedipus being this, thing that is innate, learned, an innate sort of determinant of being a human.
That's innate, and it's code right because it's instantaneous, and it is non-binary. In the sense of, it's non-judgmental. It's not like it's not yet a taboo. So
right. No. A person doesn't hear the taboo or the thing and go, "Oh, that sounds fun. I should break that rule." It's like, no, how it functions is by having these larger objects and these stories and these larger sort of things that we force into the unconscious. The way that the desiring machines operate is through this. But actually, the last sentence does go into the next paragraph. Is there anything that we should go over here? Any questions, any thoughts, any comments so far? Because we're about to dive even furthermore into incest and Oedipus, because, I mean, who doesn't want that? I mean, we all do.
Yes, as we're going into this, because we're talking about how the two ways the connective synthesis are being used here, it's important to point out too that Oedipus creates global persons in a sense, right? It conditions how global persons will be created. So we see, in reality, global persons, even the very form of persons, do not exist prior to the prohibitions that weigh on them and constitute them, any more than they exist prior to the triangulation which they desire. Into which they enter. Desire receives its first complete objects, and is forbidden them at one and the same time. So the thing here is that the construction of Oedipus in this manner actually plays into how the first synthesis is going to create global persons, right? It makes that possible. We've got a condition here. We've also got that the first complete object. So like, I think later on they're going to walk this out more, but like a detached object. So something like the mother, where like there seems to be an object of desire. Yeah, you follow me? With Oedipus here is making the form of global persons, and perhaps even persons in this respect, possible, but also like making actualizing them.
Yep, and I'm just going to dive into the next paragraph because it dovetails perfectly with that. We can therefore see the property the prohibition has of displacing itself, since, from the start, it displaces desire. It displaces itself in the sense that the Oedipal inscription does not force its way into the synthesis of recording without reacting on the synthesis of production and profoundly changing the connections of this synthesis by introducing new global persons. These new images of persons are the sister and the spouse, after the father and the mother. It has often been remarked, in fact, that the prohibition existed in two forms, the one negative, having to do above all with the mother and imposing differentiation, the other positive, concerning the sister and requiring exchange. I have a moral obligation to take as a wife someone other than my sister, and an obligation to keep my sister for someone else. I must give up my sister to a brother-in-law, receive my wife from a father-in-law. And although new Stacy's, what's the word there? Is my PDF broken? Stacy's, is that the word?
New stases or relapses.
All right. Stases or relapses are produced at this level, such as new forms of incest and homosexuality. It is certain that the Oedipal triangle would have no way of transmitting and reproducing itself without this second step. The first step elaborates the form of the triangle, but it is only the second step that ensures the transmission of this figure. I take a woman other than my sister in order to constitute the differentiated base of a new triangle, whose inverted vertex will be my child, which is called surmounting Oedipus, but reproducing it as well, transmitting it rather than dying all alone, incestuous, homosexual, and a zombie. Great paragraph.
There's the name of your new movie, Brooks.
Yeah, incestuous homosexual zombie. I think Troma's working on that right now, actually. I mean, come on.
What a time to be alive.
What a time. It's a great summary. Again, they're going to continue through this as we're diving through, because we're going to get into the familial versus the alliant in a very strong way as we hit chapter 3. So if any of that is, well, wait, why am I giving my sister away? What's this? What's their critique? They have a huge critique, a gigantic one. They're not there yet. Right now, we're simply discussing the process of desire formation, how the partial machines attach, how we learn what those desires are, and I'm putting that in big quotes that you can't see, and how the subject is produced. That's what these next few sections are about. So we're not fully there yet, but we're getting there. But it's the two steps, the form of the triangle. The second step ensures transmission of the figure.
Yeah, and we see here how Oedipus, right, it's not a natural thing. There's a way in which the Oedipal inscription, it can't just go straight to the second synthesis, right? It's got to affect the first synthesis. So we see the production of the molar in this sense as taking on the either-or distinction, well, as taking on the global persons of Oedipus. So, right, where we see the father and mother, for instance, or the wife, sister here. Right, the way that these global persons are constituted here is affected by the Oedipal, I guess we'll stick with inscription, the Oedipal inscription in that manner, which affects how it's going to work in the second synthesis and then back on the first. I feel like Ken has some thoughts here.
Oh, sorry, I was talking and I was muted. Go ahead, Ken, if you have something. All right. I will continue. Sorry, I had to take care of I had to ban somebody, which is not something I have to do very often, but occasionally it pops up. I will continue the next paragraph. Thus, the parental or familial use of the synthesis of recording extends into a conjugal use or an alliance use of the connective syntheses of production. A regime for the pairing of people replaces the connection of partial objects. On the whole, the connections of organ machines suited to desiring production give way to a pairing of people under the rules of familial reproduction. Partial objects now seem to be taken from people, rather than from the non-personal flows that pass from one person to another. The reason is that persons are derived from abstract quantities instead of from flows. Instead of a connective appropriation, partial objects become the possessions of a person and, when required, the property of another person. Just as he draws upon centuries of scholastic reflection in defining God as the principle of the disjunctive syllogism, Kant draws upon centuries of Roman juridical reflection when he defines marriage as the tie that makes a person the owner of the sexual organs of another person. One need only consult a religious manual of sexual casuistry to see with what restrictions the organ-desiring machine connections remain tolerated within the regime for the pairing of people, which legally determines what may be appropriated from the body of the wife. I'm going to continue to the next paragraph. Clearer still, sorry, go ahead, Jack.
Before you do, because I know everyone wants to read about Kant talking about sets, The reference there is from his Metaphysics of Morals, Part 1.
So just like to point out, this is a really good example. If people are ever like, what is miraculating? Like this is it. The partial objects now seem to be taken from people rather from the non-personal flows that pass from one person to another. Like that's the example of a thing miraculating from the process.
Mm-hmm. We just need to tie in the body without organs or the socius there.
They're talking about here on like the social regime of it, right? So these partial objects are seeming to come from other people, but like it's the same way they talk about like how it seems like capital is going to attract more capital because like it seems as to be emanating from the body of capital, whereas it's actually the partial objects that make up the flow, the decoded flows of desires, which capital is appropriating for itself.
Clearer still, the difference in regime becomes apparent each time a society permits an infantile stage of sexual promiscuity to subsist, where everything is permitted until the age when the young man in turn submits to the principle of pairing that regulates the social production of children. It is true that the connections of desiring production were found to comply with the binary rule, and we have even seen that a third term intervened in this binarity, the body without organs, that re-injects producing into the product, extends the connections of machine, serves as a surface of recording. But here, no biunivocal process is in fact produced that would fit production into the mold of representatives. No triangulation appears at this level that would refer the objects of desire to global persons or desire to a subject. The only subject is desire itself on the body without organs, inasmuch as it machines partial objects and flows, selecting and cutting the one with the other, passing from one body to another, following connections and appropriations that each time destroy the factitious unity of a possessive or proprietary ego, and Oedipal sexuality. It's a few great little lines in here. There is no biunivocal process. No biunivocal process is in fact produced that would fit production into the mold of representatives. We are talking specifically about the regime of desiring machines, that they don't get split off. There is no woman desiring machine. This is the real way to start thinking about this and how these concepts play with each other and play with, in general, psychoanalytic, schizoanalytic theory. There is no such thing as woman desire, man desire. It's not how it works. There is no such thing as gay desire in that sense. Machines desire. They are partial objects connecting and producing itself over and over and over. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got this very nice. I think you're gonna very much not appreciate this, but I got this Dick Land quote. I think is very very useful. So there I go. There is no more an individual Oedipus than there is an individual fantasy. Oedipus is a means of integration into the group in both the adaptive form of its own reproduction that makes it pass from one generation to the next, and in its unadaptable neurotic stasis that block desire or prearranged impasses.
I love that.
So I think,
No, that's
yeah,
great.
yeah,
Yeah, that's I think that's spot on. It's there is no, again, these are representations. These aren't desiring machines. We need to break them down. We must go further. Is basically what Deleuze and Guattari are always saying to all these people who keep breaking things down a little bit and then more and then more. It's like, we must go further. And to them, it's the partial objects are that base level, and there's no Oedipal partial object. That's not how it functions. The Oedipus doesn't like sit around and go, oh, here's a desire. No, you go that way. Now you go towards fucking your mom. That's not it. It's Oedipus gives us a series of representations, and those representations are what shape. And it's the representations of mommy, daddy, me, sister, family, nuclear family. These representations break down. They're the smaller part of that representation. And they're what sort of start messing with things. So the Triangle of Oedipus, which is the next paragraph, I'm just going to keep marching forward. The triangle takes form in the parental use and reproduces itself in the conjugal use. We do not yet know what forces bring about this triangulation that interferes with the recording of desire in order to transform all its productive connections. But we are able, at least, to follow abstractly the manner in which these forces proceed. We are told that partial objects are caught up in an intuition of precocious totality, just as the ego is caught up in an intuition of unity that precedes its fulfillment. Even in Melanie Klein, the schizoid partial object is related to a whole that prepares for the advent of the complete object in the depressive phase. It is clear that such a totality unity is posited only in terms of a certain mode of absence, as that which partial objects and subjects of desire lack. Consequently, everything is played out from the start. Everywhere we encounter the analytic process that consists in extrapolating a transcendent and common something. But that is a common universal, full purpose of introducing lack into desire, in situating and specifying persons and an ego under one aspect or another of its absence, and imposing an exclusive direction on the disjunction of the sexes. I will leave a moment for everyone to take a moment, ask questions, say what you need.
The only thing I wanted to point out while we're taking our awkward pause. So earlier they said that the only subject is desire itself on the body without organs, inasmuch as it machines partial objects and flows, selecting and cutting the one with the other, passing from one body to another, following connections and appropriating that each time destroy the factitious unity of a possessive or proprietary ego and Oedipal sexuality. So we're seeing here how that, we're expanding this idea of the subject being the three syntheses and desire, and how these function and take place, right? One of the moves they're making in this paragraph is to expand on that last point in the preceding, which is that the partial objects don't result from a lost totality, right? Nor do they lack a totality.
Can you say more about the last part? Because that's where I get mixed up.
Sure. So we're seeing with like global persons, I don't even think I need that. So let's just put it in the very simple aspect of the breast and the mouth, right? So when we're talking about the breast, there's a sense in which we can talk about the breast as a fragment of a woman's body, right? There's a sense in which we can talk about the breast as relying on a woman to be present, yeah. But I think for Deleuze and Guattari, when it comes to that first synthesis, and we're keeping it very simple right now, I realize that the breast connects to other things. Just to use their simple example, the breast is a partial object. It doesn't result from a lost totality, and it doesn't rely on a totality to be a partial object. As in this perspective as a partial object, it connects with the mouth of a baby, right? Or perhaps a different mouth. And in this sense, this connection through desire is going to be one of flows and functional, like they say, generational flows, and I think like the consumption of flows, I think is the move there. In this sense, we don't really need the totality of a woman that directs the breast in this manner. The breast, because it's working with desiring production here, is connecting with the baby in the same way that that mouth is connecting with the breast, so as to basically be part of the synthesis. So we don't need the totality of, another way to say it is, to put more in psychoanalytic terms, the mouth doesn't rely on the id of the baby to direct it or to create the desire, that the ego will then move the baby to the breast instead of the cardboard, right? Likewise, the mother's unconscious wouldn't need that. Because desiring production is in this impersonal level, and the subject is these flows in relation to the syntheses, the breast and the mouth are self-sufficient, right? They're partial objects in that manner, not resulting from a break with their totalities and not needing to be fit into a totality of something that's been lost or something they lack.
Thank you for that. I'm just trying to square it with what I know about Klein and Lacan. And it seems like a major difference is this sort of this realm of a representation that we're in. Because, like you were pointing out, Klein sort of takes this process to unfold, ending in like some sort of evaluation of the object, and that evaluation is what dictates the relationship. So you have like a good breast or a bad breast or something like that, and so there's a reification or whatever, an instantiation of a definite quality, and Lacan spends his first 11 seminars railing against this, that an object can have a singular quality be good or bad like that, and that's not how any of this works. But he does maintain that whole, there was no totality to begin with, but somehow you get wound up in this experience or something, or you learn it through introjection, that you've lost something.
Right. No, the thing, though, isn't that they're saying there's no totality to begin with. It's that there's no totality to end with either.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's not a totality that is yet to come, that it is only the beginning part of. Like there's no totality.
Yeah. And Lacan says the same thing about the problem with the ideal ego. So the ideal ego has that sense that there is some sort of totality. But it seems like fundamentally different scopes, and I'm just trying to get a taste for the difference. So thank you for letting me think it out.
No, and I think, if you want to talk about Freud and Lacan, I'm going to read the next paragraph and we're just going to go because we have a little bit to get through still. But the next paragraph begins. Such in the case in Freud. For example, for castration, for the second phase of the fantasy, a child is being beaten, or again for the famous latency period, where the analytical mystification culminates, this common transcendent absent something will be called phallus or law in order to designate the signifier that distributes the effects of meaning throughout the chain and introduces exclusions there, whence the Oedipalizing interpretations of Lacanism. Lacanism, I've never been able to say that word properly. This fire acts as the formal cause of the triangulation. That is to say, makes possible both the form of the triangle and its reproduction. Oedipus has, as its formula, 3 plus 1, the one of the transcendent phallus, without which the terms considered would not take the form of a triangle. It is as if the so-called signifying chain, made up of elements that are themselves non-signifying, of polyvocal writing and detachable fragments, were the object of a special treatment, a crushing operation that extracted a detached object from the chain, a despotic signifier from whose law the entire chain seems consequently to be suspended, each link triangulated. There we have a curious paralogism, implying a transcendent use of the syntheses of the unconscious. We pass from detachable partial objects to the detached complete object from which global persons derive by an assigning of lack. For example, in the capitalist code and its trinitary expression, money as detachable chain is converted into capital as detached object, which only exists in the fetishist view of stocks and lacks. I'm going to read the footnote very quickly where it says, one of the transcendent phallus, without which the terms considered would not take up the form of triangle. It's from Edmund Ortigues. Not going to anglicize it. In order that the necessary conditions for the existence of a structure in the familial institution or in the Oedipus complex to be fulfilled, at least 4 terms are required. That is, 1 term more than is naturally necessary. That's the moment of lack, the introduction of this, the thing we're missing, the phallus in this situation. I think I'm just going to continue because they're going to dive right into the Oedipal code. The same is true of the Oedipal code. The libido as energy of selection and detachment is converted into the phallus as detached object, the latter existing only in the transcendent form of stock and lack, something common and absent that is just as lacking in men as in women. It is this conversion that makes the whole of sexuality shift into the Oedipal framework. This projection of all the breaks flows onto the same mythical locale and all the non-signifying signs, same major signifier. Quote, the effective triangulation makes it possible to assign sexuality to one of the sexes. The partial objects have lost nothing of their virulence and efficacy. Yet, the reference to the penis gives its full meaning to castration. Through it, all the external experiences linked to deprivation, to frustration, to the lack of partial objects take on meaning after the fact. All previous history is recast in a new version in the light of castration. I feel like it's pure Lacan. Ken?
I'm just trying to remember what he said about anti-production, because there's a line here to it. Because they're talking about the phallus, but Lacan doesn't start with the phallus, right? And so, I mean, it is that idea of all drives are virtually death drives. That in sex or any sort of connective creative activity, there's going to be destruction or disconnection or whatever. The two aren't mutually exclusive, and I'm having a hard time parsing that. But yeah, this sounds like it's supposed to be dedicated to Lacan, but Lacan, I mean, doesn't make. There is no lack in the real. The real is over full, and the lack only comes into place in trying to symbolize the real, trying to make some sort of totality, and that's the problem. And this is the problem that Lacan had with Melanie Klein, is that or just even ego psychology in general, is that it's alienating. Is that this is like the fundamental alienating movement to misrecognize one's enjoyment as being one's own. That I am the cause of my desire, or I am this thing. So I don't know. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, I'm. Who said it's from Green? Andre Green wrote that quote that they use at the end there. I'll have to look into that. I will find translations and use of that. He wrote a piece called Living Affect, Oedipus in Africa, things like that. Like he's got a few pieces on this they seem to be taking from. So we'll run with that afterwards. Anyone have any questions or comments? A lot of this is, if you're not understanding it, I'm just going to be like, Ken's going to be whatever. Generally, it's okay to not fully understand a lot of what they're talking about with Freud. It's a way for them to position themselves in critique against what was very much the prevailing theories of the day. They're doing hard against Freud here, and they will be going hard against Lacan, not as hard, but pretty tough still. So it's about placing themselves against that. It's not as necessary to fully understand them, I don't think. So it's okay if you're not fully grasping a lot of this stuff that they're talking about with Oedipus and the triangulation and phallus and all that. It's a whole fucking thing.
Well, it's basically the foreclosure of castration, which is something I think they are mentioning in regard to the libido. Because we live in this capitalist society, we are subjugated to the foreclosure of castration, and we don't have actually, I would say phallus, but it's actually an anal thing to have money to possess it. And I would say that to have the master's discourse, you would have a strong sense of your anal drive, which is actually beneficial to homosexuals, I suppose. but I am putting myself back on the leash, and I'd say that it's actually not that hard. That three plus one signifying chain around the phallus, but it's actually because it is this. It's negated to castration because, of course, we live in a society with women as well as men. So to make this for everyone, basically there is a foreclosure which is interjected, which is the castration, the foreclosure of castration. I don't think they named it foreclosure because they keep repeating, but they keep repeating it. How the phallus is detached is basically the foreclosure of castration, I suppose, which is a concept in, I think, seminar 20.
Cool. Again, this is not easy shit, and it's a lot to dive into. So don't think that like this is not as necessary to understand fully, because they, again, a lot of their philosophy, a lot of this writing comes from a place of a positive origination. If you're, for example, going to decide, oh, I want to go down the road and learn about Lacan, yeah, you really need to understand this shit, because the act of negation and how foreclosure works and all of that is, I found it very difficult to dive into, and I still don't fully grasp it overall. But they come from a place of basically a fully affirming, interesting direction, so you don't have to worry about it quite as much. Just my thought. Someone out there is going to disagree. I will move on to the next thing. It's about lack and its history. That is indeed what disturbs us, this recasting of history and this lack attributed to partial objects. How could partial objects not have lost their virulence and efficacy once they had been introduced into use of a synthesis that remains fundamentally illegitimate with regards to them? We do not deny that there is an Oedipal sexuality, an Oedipal heterosexuality, and homosexuality, an Oedipal castration, as well as complete objects, global images, and specific egos. We deny that these are productions of the unconscious. What is more, castration and Oedipalization beget a basic illusion that makes us believe that real desiring production is answerable to higher formations that integrate it, subject it to transcendent laws, and make it serve a higher social and cultural production. There then appears a kind of unsticking of the social field with regard to the production of desire, in whose name all resignations are justified in advance. Psychoanalysis, at the most concrete level of therapy, reinforces this apparent movement with its combined forces. Psychoanalysis itself ensures this conversion of the unconscious in what it calls pre-Oedipal. It sees a stage that must be surmounted in the direction of an evolutive integration towards the depressive position under the reign of the complete object, or organized in the direction of a structural integration towards a position of a despotic signifier under the reign of the phallus. The aptitude for conflict of which Freud spoke, the qualitative opposition between homosexuality and heterosexuality, is in fact a consequence of Oedipus. Far from being an obstacle to treatment encountered from without, it is a product of Oedipalization and a counter effect of the treatment that reinforces it. When they said at the end of the last section, they said, we must find a cure for the cure. This is what they're referring to quite a bit. Again, to say, they do not deny that Oedipus exists as a complex. There are people out there who want to do these things and who feel this. There are people out there who there are global images. There are specific egos. Like they're not saying that these things don't exist. They're saying that they are not productions of the unconscious. These things are not the base level, that the desires aren't in service of these things.
So this is why you want to be careful about when we say like they're breaking from psychoanalysis. The re-engagement with Freud is similar to Lacan trying to re-engage Freud, very differently though, especially because like Deleuze and Guattari are not going to say we figured out Freud, like we're his rightful interpreter. What their criticism accomplishes here, right? So we see in the very beginning, what a mistake to have said the id. Is desire in production the new id? It wasn't possible without the Freudian id to make this move, and yet it seems wrong to say that they're the same thing, to equivocate the two. We find ourselves immediately faced with a juxtaposition, and a critical one at that. As we're going through this, right, we're seeing how their engagement with Oedipus, Freud, and psychoanalysis in this manner, right, the way they're performing their criticism, they're not going to negate Oedipus, but they are going to affirm not only that Oedipus has its place in that, they're going to provide an account of how it's created, how it functions in its creation, which we're seeing here, how it affects the unconscious as Deleuze and Guattari are constructing it through the syntheses, and how those how these play back on one another. Right, this is really important because Oedipus does still have this affect, right? This even though it's a representation, it still displaces desire, as we'll see later on in this chapter, and as we're seeing now, actually. But that being said, right, the task is as we talk about round tables, is going to be creating those lines of escape in relation to that.
I'm going to go ahead and read the last paragraph, and then we'll discuss. In reality, the problem has nothing to do with pre-Oedipal stages that would still revolve around an Oedipal axis, but rather with the existence and the nature of an An-Oedipal sexuality, an An-Oedipal heterosexuality and homosexuality, an An-Oedipal castration. The breaks flows of desiring production do not let themselves be projected onto a mythical locale. The signs of desire do not let themselves be extrapolated from a signifier. Transsexuality does not let any qualitative opposition between a local and nonspecific heterosexuality and a local and nonspecific homosexuality arise. Everywhere in this reversion, the innocence of flowers instead of the guilt of conversion. But rather than ensuring or tending to ensure the reversion of the entire unconscious according to the An-Oedipal form and within the An-Oedipal content of desiring production, analytic theory and practice never cease to promote the conversion of the unconscious to Oedipus, form and content. We shall see in effect what psychoanalysis calls resolving Oedipus. This conversion is therefore promoted by psychoanalysis, first of all by making a global and specific use of the connective syntheses. This use can be defined as transcendent and implies a first paralogism in the psychoanalytic process. For simple reason, we again make use of Kantian terminology. In what he termed the critical revolution, Kant intended to discover criteria immanent to understanding so as to distinguish the legitimate and illegitimate use of the syntheses of consciousness. In the name of transcendental philosophy, immanence of criteria, he therefore denounced the transcendent use of syntheses such as appeared in metaphysics. In like fashion, we are compelled to say that psychoanalysis has its metaphysics. Its name is Oedipus, and that a revolution, this time materialist, can proceed only by way of a critique of Oedipus, by denouncing the illegitimate use of the syntheses of the unconscious as found in Oedipal psychoanalysis, so as to rediscover a transcendental unconscious defined by the immanence of its criteria, and a corresponding practice that we shall call schizoanalysis.
So let's go right back to a question Bo asked in the beginning, right, which is how do we find the illegitimate and the legitimate uses? That's it right there, right? The transcendent and the immanent criteria are the differentiation that play into what will be paralogistic when it's transcendent and what will be syllogistic when it's immanent.
Yes, and again, we're talking, there's 3 steps to the syntheses. This first one is about desire and what it connects to, and partial objects and how they function. So when we talk about the difference of immanent versus transcendental, that's how that's when we get to schizoanalysis, which we have, a lot of you were around for when we did our summary of that, but this is one of those steps. This is what we're trying to do with our schizo project is, I said transcendent, didn't I, Jack?
Transcendental. It always trips me up too because it's such a subtle thing.
Yes, sorry, talking quickly. Transcendent versus immanent would be the difference. But to say again, though, everything else I was saying was right. That this is the difference between the proper use of the syntheses, the allowance of syntheses to connect as they do, partial objects to connect as they do, and produce as they do, versus that of the transcendent, which actually utilizes representation and demands of that, and isn't really where the partial objects are connecting. I am transcendence, yes, Joe. So that's not a bad pun for English being like your second, third, or whatever language. It's not bad. Anyone have questions here? This would be the time. Type them up in the chat. If you want, we can happily unmute you. Any questions on this section? Because we're done. It is time to discuss. Did we miss a question? Do we do anything? Because I'm happy to finish up and close out. Don't worry. I'm happy to do that.
You want to go over how the new question bot works?
Yeah, so we have a new bot. The way it works is unique and a little different. We're trying to figure out how to we've gotten a lot of people who have questions and setups. So in the chat, you'll see me type a question. You type tilde Q, and then you type ask, because you have a question you want to ask. You ask, explain this whole section. And you get a little check mark. And then at any point, those of us at the top can go excellent list. We answered Rimsky's question. Excellent. And it just keeps listing them. So we can actually keep track of what questions we've answered, who's got things to say, all of that fun stuff. Because we've been having a problem with questions getting lost in what is a very fast chat. And it's only going to get worse over time. So with any luck, this gets you to a nice little spot where we can have conversations over time. And you can also do this other thing where you type tilde H and you type up. That's if you have something to say, put your hand up, and then I can actually just find out who has their hand up because they want to say something. So if I tend to be long-winded, Joe tends to be long-winded. Between the two of us, we tend to spend 6 or 7 hours talking and no one else gets a word in. Raise your hand and we can kind of be watching when people raising their hands, someone else wants to talk, we can start taking breaks and allowing that. So we're trying to make it a more inclusive conversation overall. So if this sucks, we'll find other bots. We're just starting. Ken is asking, what is the relationship between transcendental and representation? The transcendent is desiring machines are by nature immanent. They connect to what they connect to. There is no thought. There is no desire around what they're connecting to. It's just the things that they're connecting to. The BWO operates as a bit of a goal for that. But at this point, we don't have representation. There's no, a baby when it's first born does not go, excellent, where is mother? I would like my milk. They do in comedies, bad ones like Boss Baby, sort of mock this and have this as a joke. But the nature of the reality is that we have representations in order to deal with things, but desire doesn't operate on them. Instead, it operates like a baby's does, even when we don't think it does and we're nice and old and we think that we've created desire and we're all special. That's not really how it works. So representations are by nature transcendent. When we say, oh, it's Oedipus, or the ego, or these other large-scale things that exist far beyond, they don't. They're just representations. They're by nature transcendent.
But they still do quite a bit. So to get into like some of the meat of this question too, we saw how there's a transcendent phallus, right? There's a transcendent signifier, or despotic signifier. We're talking here about how an object gets detached, right? How that affects the assemblage so that things start to be, right, the idea is that it would appear to be a lack of that which is detached, right? And this creates a transcendent use of the syntheses, because now the argument is the unconscious is producing so as to satisfy that lack, or to right, so try and resolve it, or to basically be constituted in that in the sense of that lack, right? So in the sense of the phallus, or to resolve the lack of the phallus, or to resolve that very lack of the phallus, right? With the despotic signifier, we see a similar problem where part of the signifying chain stands above and meaning is distributed in that manner. So here we would have like the phallus, for instance. the meaning of the sign function of the functionalities that are distributed during the second synthesis, falling back on the first synthesis, right, on production itself. This is constituted through that transcendent signifier. So now the way the unconscious is communicating with itself, to keep it simple, is now thought to be, and this is a parallelism, is now considered to be through this kind of privileged sign, or this basic like a signifier that that where everything else is going to derive its meanings from, that the functions are all in service of the function, which is where you see them actually put the in quotation marks.
To sit with a long, awkward silence as we try to find out what is happening. And if anyone has questions, I don't mind awkward silences at all, in fact.
Let's give, since Ken asked a question, we can put him on the spot. Does that address your question? Do you have like comments?
Yeah, it does address my question. I'm still in a whirlpool of associations, sort of. And it's like, so where do Deleuze and Guattari fall on the topic of like meaning? Like, there is no formal meaning in this molecular world, right?
They very much value what can be done with a thing, or the production of something, over what does it mean or what does it express.
So it's goat, right? What you mean, Ben? Or am I mistaken?
It seems like what they don't like are these singular functions attributed to partial objects, because like the phallus is meaningless, and it only, in its case, it only has an effect by it being like a sort of signifier without a signified.
So the phallus and like the despondent signifier, right? There's a way in which those become through their elevation. There's like a way in which their centralization, in that sense, or their transcendent aspect, allows one to derive that meaning from them, right? So all signifiers get their meaning through their relationship through the transcendent. All things connecting, like the partial objects, get their meaning through the detached object of the phallus, right? But this would be paralogistic. Syllogistically, they're still working with those signifying chains in that, but this is in terms of functionalities, right? So we're seeing how when a flow like that of the breast and the mouth, best example ever, right? The flow there's a way in which those two partial objects are going to take on functions, right? For them, that question of what it does, like Ben says, that's the proper question to ask when we're talking about meaning in that, as opposed to asking what it is so as to place it basically through like another derivation, right? That's kind of what they're worried about, is that if we ask the question of what it is and we place meaning in that sense, right? So I'll pick on phenomenology here, right? Is meaning only possible through the condition of a transcendent ego or a transcendent conscious? Is meaning only possible through a transcendent phallus? Similarly.
Remke asks, don't understand the title. Why is it called the connective synthesis of production? Does connective refer to connections between partial objects? I think I missed it. Yeah, I mean, they don't say it directly that clearly, but yes, the connective synthesis is the part of the syntheses where partial objects connect, and they're always connecting. They're basically always connecting, all of them, all the time, to tons of other ones, and it's the first thing. Essentially, it's the first thing that happens inside of the setup. It's always starts with that. The edge with it, and they'll get into this a lot more in the second and third, is that moment of connection is also the moment of production. Connection and production are wrapped together in this, where it's because it's connecting, in that connection it's producing, and then it actually is continuing to connect and produce, connect and produce, connect and produce, connect and produce over and over and over. It's this sort of self-fulfilling, cool little engine machine.
they're gonna call it also like a serial and infinite connection. Think like this is connected to that, and then that is connected to the next thing, and then that is connected to the next thing infinitely in both directions all the time.
You guys are making some good points there. We need to add one more thing, which is the breaks, right? So during the connective synthesis, we have the flows, which is going to be part of that connection between the partial objects. Those flows change during that relationship, right? And they get differentiated. And when they get cut or broke with the assemblage, if we like, right? So partial objects come into the assemblage, partial objects leave the assemblage. The flows keep breaking and connecting in that manner too.
Any other comments or questions? Because I think we're nearing the end, and we can start wrapping down. But raccoons have a bone in their penis, Jack, just letting you know. So
Get the hell out of here, really?
yeah, they actually have a bone in their penis.
How do you know that? Did you dissect a raccoon penis?
The shit the internet has taught me that is not only useless but also terrifying. Like raccoon dicks are like the least of it.
Leaving this part of the conversation in would be the most Delusian thing possible to do.
All right, and with raccoon dick bones, we are going to close out. Thank you all very much today. Thank you to our handful of viewers. No, they're real. They're horrifying. And I'm going to go ahead and close this out. What the fuck is with us? It's been fun. Thank you guys so much for joining. And as always, this is a blast.